The story I want to tell in this lecture, which coincides with the publication of my new book, and for that, and for, in fact, the invitation to Greece, I have to thank my publisher, Panos Travalos, from Travalos Publishing, whom I've worked with on translating my books into Greek for the last 11, 12 years now. So, yes, so my man in Greece is Panos, so thank you for the invitation. Oh, yes, well, look, if you're going to start clapping for people, you might as well clap for... Right, no, that's still not working. I'll carry on standing here. What I want to talk about is a new area of science. It's very new, which means there are very few people working in it. There is still some suspicion about how important it is. It brings together various areas of science. I became involved in it 20 years ago, but it was still just a hobby. And only in the last few years have new discoveries been made, new experimental results in science that have really pushed this subject to the very front of what is exciting in research, in physics, chemistry, and biology. Quantum mechanics is one of the most difficult, one of the most puzzling and mysterious sciences. But it's also probably the most important science. For me, as a physicist, I will say that. Maybe a biologist would disagree, and they would say Darwin's theory of evolution is more important. But quantum mechanics describes our reality. It describes the building blocks of our universe. So physicists and chemists have had almost 100 years to try and get a little bit more comfortable with quantum mechanics. Now, for the first time, we're applying it to life, to biology, and asking the question, what does quantum mechanics have to say in biology? So, first of all, if I move away, this is still not working. Yeah, actually, thank you. Okay. Yes, good. I can't stand in one place. When I lecture, I like to walk around. I like to have lots of energy, and so. What I want to, first of all, introduce you to what does it mean when we talk about quantum mechanics? What is the quantum world? If you look at this picture, if we think about size, and every diagram here running from the right to the left goes down by one order of magnitude. So you divide the length by 10. So you begin with something, an everyday object like a tennis ball of order 10 centimeters diameter, and you get smaller and smaller. And so you get down to a millimeter, we look at the eye of a needle, then down to a cancer cell, bacteria. A virus is much smaller than living cells. Then all the way down to the building blocks of life, the DNA. And if you go even smaller, then you get down to the molecular and the atomic world. And you can go even smaller. Particle physicists will go down to inside the atomic nucleus and the particles that make atoms. But the quantum world starts somewhere in this area, on the nanometer scale. We talk about nanotechnology. Nanotechnology means the world down at the scale of a nanometer, 1/1000th of a meter. At that size scale, the laws of physics that we understand in our everyday world, the laws of physics that we learn at school, Newton's laws of motion, don't work. And we have to use a new mechanics, the quantum mechanics, which was developed in the 1920s. Quantum mechanics helped us understand the building blocks of matter. It helped us understand what an atom is. So this picture of an atom is actually wrong. It's the picture of an atom which we learn about in school, which was first developed by Ernest Rutherford and Niels Bohr back before the First World War, the first couple of decades of the 20th century. But it's very helpful because it tells us an atom has a nucleus and electrons going around the outside, and inside the nucleus we have two kinds of particles, protons and neutrons, and then physicists looked inside protons and neutrons and found quarks. And so you can think about the matter, everything made up in our world, us and the ground we stand on, the air we breathe, everything is made up of essentially up quark, down quark, and electron. They make up atoms. And then there are also particles called neutrinos, which no one really likes very much because they're boring. But physicists kept discovering more, understanding the deeper structure of matter. So this is the famous picture of one of the big detectors in CERN in Geneva at the Large Hadron Collider. This is the Atlas detector. And you can see that this is essentially a camera. But it's a camera so big that you can see this is an engineer standing there. So that giant machine is used to look at the smallest particles in the universe. And I'm sure many of you will remember a few years ago when the Large Hadron Collider discovered the Higgs boson, which was a particle that had been predicted to exist by our theories, but no one had seen it until 2012. And so in physics, by the second half of the 20th century, we had this side of this diagram, what's called the standard model of particle physics. We used quantum mechanics to describe everything in the universe and how it was made, all those particles. But there are still mysteries in physics. For example, the Large Hadron Collider is now looking for another family of particles called supersymmetric particles. We don't know if they exist, but some theories predict they exist. Then we look out into the universe, and astronomers are puzzled by other matter and energy out there, what's called dark matter and dark energy, which don't fit into this picture. So there are still mysteries that we need to solve. But physicists basically have used quantum mechanics to understand a lot about our universe. Chemists as well. Chemists have learnt a lot by using quantum mechanics. The periodic table of elements, every school, anywhere in the world will have a picture of Mendeleev's table, the classification of all the different kinds of elements in the universe. To understand this table, why are these elements arranged like this? We need quantum mechanics. Because quantum mechanics tells us the rules that explain how electrons arrange themselves inside atoms. And those properties give us the different elements. So, quantum mechanics has been hugely successful, describing so much of science. But at its heart, it is very, very puzzling. I wrote a book many years ago on quantum mechanics, and this was the old cover of the book. So I'm not trying to sell the book because it doesn't have this cover anymore. So this is not marketing. But I show you because I put a quote on the back of the book by Niels Bohr. That's one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. He said, if you're not astonished by quantum mechanics, then you haven't understood it. If someone explains quantum mechanics and you say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I understand, obviously you haven't understood. Because you're meant to say, no, come on, that's crazy. That can't be right. That's impossible that the world could behave in this way. So, quantum mechanics is unusual. It's strange. It goes against logic. My favorite description of quantum mechanics I represent by this picture. This is the quantum skier. This is the quantum world. This is what happens in the quantum world. So he seems healthy. The tree seems okay. He looks like he could, if he wanted to be a father one day, maybe he could be. That doesn't seem to be any but somehow his skis have gone either side of the tree. This is what we see in the quantum world. We see behavior that can only be explained by something very strange happening. Atoms being in two places at once, doing two things at once, talking to each other across distance. That's what's so perplexing about quantum mechanics. And so it's not surprising that biologists have not been very comfortable about quantum mechanics. In fact, they have argued that and quite rightly, they've been very successful in describing and developing new areas of science. Cell biology became molecular biology, became genetics, and now we have the 21st century as the century of biology with genetic engineering and genomics, and it's a very, very exciting area. But it doesn't use quantum mechanics. Biologists have, until recently I guess, described the molecules of life using balls and sticks. So different color balls represent different elements. So here the black balls are carbon, the white balls are hydrogen, I guess the red and blue are oxygen and nitrogen. And you can build complicated molecules like a child's toy. But of course with computers, now we can build very sophisticated models of biomolecules. So this is a protein made of 100,000 atoms. And you can understand how they all behave and vibrate and bond together. But there's not much in the way of quantum mechanics here. However, a quantum physicist will say, or a quantum chemist will say, look, if quantum physics is the foundation, that is the basis of reality, quantum physics should describe organic chemistry. After all, organic chemistry is collecting together atoms to make organic molecules. How those atoms bond together, how they stick together, must obey the laws of quantum mechanics, because you're talking about how electrons interact with each other. That's the quantum world. Organic chemistry, if you build it up in complexity, eventually you should reach molecular biology, which of course means life. So on a very simplistic, naive, logical level, we can say that all life ultimately must rely on quantum mechanics at some deep level. But then the argument is, but everything in the universe at some deep level must rely on quantum mechanics. What's the big deal? What's so surprising? You don't have to create a new science to tell me something that is obvious, that I am made of atoms, and atoms ultimately have to be described by quantum mechanics. Quantum biology, what I want to talk about, is different. It's not saying you need to describe life using quantum mechanics because everything is made of atoms and atoms are quantum mechanical objects. It's saying something different. In the 1940s, the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger wrote a very famous book called What is Life? He was one of a number of physicists who in the 1920s, when they had developed quantum mechanics, felt very arrogant that quantum physics and quantum physicists could explain all of the sciences. So they left their labs and said, right, okay, so chemistry, we'll solve those problems for you. Biology, I'm sure we can also resolve those problems. We are the masters of the universe. And a number of physicists did move into biology. Schrödinger wrote his book, What is Life?, based on a series of lectures he gave. By this time, this was in the mid-1940s, just before the end of the war, this book came out. And he'd already moved, he'd escaped Germany and moved to Ireland. He was the first person to ask the question about how important quantum mechanics might be in life. Not just the obvious life, everything is made of atoms, but those weirder aspects of quantum mechanics, the skier going both ways around the tree, those strange features of quantum mechanics, do they play a role in life? In fact, he asked the question, is what is special about life due to quantum mechanics? Does life use quantum mechanics in a way that makes biology different from chemistry? Okay, what is it that an object makes an object alive compared with an object that isn't alive? Is it using some trick from the quantum world? Well, these ideas really then died down after the Second World War. There's an interesting story of why quantum biology didn't emerge as a subject after the war. And it's mainly, well, there's two reasons. One reason is that at the same time that quantum mechanics was becoming so successful and nuclear physics was developing in the 1930s, in biology, molecular biology was also being born. And molecular biology was also being incredibly successful. And genetics was developing very quickly, without any need for quantum mechanics. But the other reason is one of the main champions of quantum biology was another quantum physicist by the name of Pascal Jordan. Jordan was one of the founding fathers. He published a number of very important papers with Werner Heisenberg, for example. Jordan became very interested in this question. Is quantum mechanics important in explaining life? Unfortunately, Jordan was a Nazi. And I mean, you know, not just one of the Germans who kept their head down and didn't criticize. No, he was, you know, 100% ideologically a Nazi. So after the war, of course, quantum biology became disreputable because of its association with Pascal Jordan. And scientists forgot about it for many decades. Then, this is the front cover of the magazine Nature, one of the most important science publications in the world. And on the front cover is a picture of a robin, and you can see in the poster of the Greek translation of my book is a bird's wing. And I will explain the relevance of that bird in a few minutes. But the article was written by one of Britain's leading science writers, Phil Ball, talking about the dawn, the birth of a new area of science, quantum biology. This is only in 2011. Okay, so this shows that something must be happening a few years ago that led to a re-emergence of this field. I mentioned at the start that I became aware of interesting questions and interesting problems in biology that might require quantum mechanics about 20 years ago. In 1997, a colleague of mine at the University of Surrey, who is a molecular geneticist, John Joe McFadden, gave a seminar in the physics department. He was talking about a particular problem in biology, something called adaptive mutations, where it wasn't quite understood why bacteria will mutate in a particular direction rather than another if somehow they can predict that in the future that would be the most favorable way to mutate, where mutations should be random. And John Joe McFadden gave this talk to the physics department suggesting that there might be a quantum mechanical explanation. Almost all of my colleagues dismissed it. They said this is just crazy. I thought it was probably crazy, but I had a coffee with John Joe and talked to him about it. And that then kicked off a 20-year collaboration between us, thinking about, discussing, publishing work on quantum biology. But it remains a very controversial subject. What then has happened in the last few years? Well, there have been experimental results that have shown very clearly that there are certain mechanisms in biology inside cells that you can only explain if you use quantum mechanics, the weirdness of quantum mechanics. So the idea that my colleague John Joe McFadden had, although we published a paper on it, it was a very speculative paper. We call it a hand-waving paper. In physics, if you're just waving your hands about, that means you don't really understand the theory. You're just philosophizing. It's not proper physics. But we made some suggestions, but then we decided that was probably not so interesting. But that was with that paper we published in 1999. So over a decade before this article in Nature. But round about the beginning of the 21st century, these new experimental results were coming out, suggesting the quantum effects. So what I want to do is mention a few of these examples and what is the quantum strange behavior that they seem to require. This is a computer simulation of an electron trapped inside a box on the left-hand side. Now, in quantum mechanics, particles can also behave like waves. And you can never know for sure, so this is what we call Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can never know for sure where a particle is. And if you know where it is, you don't know how fast it's moving. You can't know everything about it. And that means in the quantum world, particles like electrons behave like ghosts. They're spread out, they're wavy, you can't pin them down. And so this blob of light essentially tells us an electron is somewhere in that region. And you see when it bounces off this barrier in the middle, you see these lines. Those are interference lines. If you remember from school using what's called the ripple tank and water hitting a barrier, when water hits a barrier and comes back, the waves interfere with each other and you get this behavior. That's what we see in the quantum world with particles. But what's interesting here is you can see a faint patch of light moving through into the right side. Now, in reality, this is just a computer simulation, but in reality, this is what would happen. A particle will hit a barrier which it should never be able to penetrate. But like a ghost walking through a wall, there is a chance that that particle can actually pass through this energy barrier in a way that should be impossible. And this is called quantum tunneling. And we know it happens. And there are many examples in nature down at the quantum level where we see quantum tunneling. What was discovered in the 1970s and then confirmed in experiments in America in the 1980s is that inside living cells, enzymes, these large molecules that carry out so much of the work inside living cells, enzymes do lots and lots of very interesting and complicated jobs. And they're cutting molecules up and rearranging them and building them and moving things around. Part of what they do, see, the wonderful thing about enzymes is that they act as catalysts. Now, in chemistry, the word catalyst means something that speeds up, that encourages a chemical reaction to happen faster. Enzymes speed up biological processes inside cells many, many, many times faster than they would without them. And it was discovered that one of the ways they do this is because they are able to transport particles, electrons, protons. Protons are essentially hydrogen atoms, the nuclei of hydrogen atoms. Move them from one place, from one part of a molecule to another, very, very quickly. And the only way they could do that is through quantum tunneling. And so experiments were carried out to check whether this was in fact what was happening, and it was confirmed that enzymes use quantum tunneling. So that was the first hint that real strange quantum behavior takes place inside living cells. It was surprising, and it was surprising because quantum behavior it's very delicate. And it needs very special conditions. When physicists are trying to test or study quantum phenomena in the laboratory, they have to work very hard. They cool their material down to near absolute zero. They do their experiments in a vacuum. They have to protect the experiment from the outside environment to make sure there is no disturbance or interference. And even then, it's very hard to see the quantum behavior. So to suggest that quantum tunneling might happen inside a living cell, which is a very warm, noisy... Ooh, my microphone has just come on. Good. I don't have to shout so much now. Or is it this one? No. Yes. Oh, look at that. Good. Right. So it was surprising that quantum behavior could take place inside a living cell when it's so complex. It was very hard to believe. But it was confirmed. And so physicists and chemists, mainly physicists and chemists, not so much the biologists, because the biologists had never needed to study quantum mechanics. So a lot of the theory was developed by quantum physicists and quantum chemists. A lot of the experiments were carried out by chemists and spectroscopists. They were able to study these molecules and see if they could find other interesting quantum effects. So an area that I've been studying with colleagues at Surrey is to ask the question whether quantum tunneling can be seen in DNA, in mutations. If you look at the double helix structure of DNA and zoom in, so the lines of DNA, DNA is made up of these large molecules called nucleotides, and there are 4 different types: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and you call them A, T, G, and C. These are the building blocks that carry the information of life. And they are held together. Essentially, the 2 strands of DNA are held together by chemical bonds. These are hydrogen bonds. Essentially, a hydrogen atom links one molecule on one strand of DNA with another on the other side. If I look in even more closely, so these are 2 of the nucleotides. This is A and T. These white balls, so this is a computer, it looks like a toy model. I had a PhD student a few years ago who was running computer simulations. It took him many months to produce this picture. He tells me it was complicated and he was working very hard. It looks quite simple to me, but for the aficionados, it was developed using a method called density functional theory, DFT, which is very useful for chemists and physicists. But what is going on? So these white balls are hydrogen atoms or protons, and they stick together. So this is an oxygen atom, and that's a nitrogen atom, and those are 2 nitrogens. And these double bonds, these hydrogen bonds, hold the nuclei together. They hold the DNA strands in the double helix together. It was proposed over half a century ago, actually, by a physical chemist called Per-Olof Loudon, a Swedish physical chemist, who said it's possible for this proton to jump across there and this one to jump across there. This is glue that's held together. But this proton prefers to live on this side, and this one prefers to live on that side. But it's possible that they could jump across to the other. If they do, and the strands then separate in the process of replication, when each strand makes a copy of itself, but the protons are in the wrong position, that would lead to a mutation. And Loudon asked the question, can they jump across even if there's an energy barrier, even if they don't have enough energy themselves to jump across? Can they quantum tunnel across? Now, back then when he published his work in the 1960s, we didn't have the computational power to answer this question accurately. But now a number of groups around the world are asking and checking. So, for example, if they jump across, they would look like that. So you can see if I jump across, see how they're moving across. So we've calculated what are the chances of these protons quantum tunneling across. And we still don't know for sure. It would seem that it's probably a low probability, and it may be not so interesting, but we haven't given up on checking this carefully to see if in fact quantum tunneling can influence mutations. Because if quantum tunneling is important in mutations, and you think about how important mutations is for life, the variety of life, evolution wouldn't work without random mutations and changes. Now, there are many reasons why mutations would take place in DNA, but we don't know whether quantum tunneling is one of those factors. There are other examples, there are other reasons why, other interesting results in quantum biology. So I want to give you 3 other examples, not work that I've been involved in myself, but certainly various groups around the world are interested. One is how we smell, how we use our sense of smell, not whether we have a smelly, anyway. The standard theory of smell is that the molecules of scent that are floating in the air will enter the nose, and there are what are called receptor molecules that will receive these scent molecules, and they will only fit inside if they have the right shape. So this is called the shape theory. And it's also known as the lock and key mechanism. So a molecule of scent will fit into the receptor if it has the right shape, and it's like a key unlocking a lock, and then the receptor sends a signal to your brain and says, I've picked up this scent, and it smells oranges or cinnamon or whatever. So recognizing smells was thought to be down entirely to the shape of the molecule, of the scent molecule. But more recently, there have been problems with this theory, because sometimes you can have molecules with very different shapes that have the same smell. So these different molecules all have the scent of musk. So if the shape theory is correct, how can we not differentiate between these? How are these all being picked up by the same receptor? So there's been a new theory that suggests that it's the vibrations in the bonds of these molecules that's important, the frequency of the vibrations. So they all have similar structure inside, even if their shape is different. And it has been proposed that quantum mechanics can explain vibration theory. The idea is that the molecule will come into the receptor, and when it sits in the receptor, it's like when you swipe a card through a card reader that has the magnetic strip, and you slide the strip through, it activates something. Well, the card with the magnetic strip, that's the scent molecule, and the reader is the receptor. And its vibrations will trigger a quantum process inside the receptor. So it may be that quantum mechanics explains how we smell, and how all animals use their sense of smell. But we don't know yet. It's one of the areas of that being studied. Another area which is more respected, I think, because more scientists have been working on it, depends on that idea of the skier going around the tree both directions. This depends on a process in quantum mechanics called superposition. Now, my area of research originally was nuclear physics, and still is nuclear physics. That's where I've published most of my work over the last 25, 30 years. And so I'm very used to using quantum mechanics. Inside the atomic nucleus, everything is quantum. In fact, that's the only way we can describe how the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus arrange themselves. And there's a nice example in nuclear physics. So this is the nucleus of an isotope of the element lead. It's called lead-186. So it has 186 protons and neutrons. And we can only explain its properties if we think about lead as being in three different shapes. There's the sphere. Oblate means you get a ball and you squash it down. So like the Earth is oblate, so it gets squashed around the equator. And then prolate is like a rugby ball, American football, so that you stretch it. Now this molecule is not changing between these three shapes dynamically. It exists in all three shapes together simultaneously in a way that just shouldn't make sense. So you may be familiar, one of the big mysteries of quantum mechanics usually is described in terms of Schrödinger's famous cat. Schrödinger's cat in the box that can be dead and alive at the same time until you open the box. Well, this is like Schrödinger's cat. The nucleus that can be in many shapes simultaneously. When you look at it, when you try to measure what shape it has, you find it only has one of them. But you can only explain its other properties if, when you're not looking, it's simultaneously in these three shapes. This idea of superposition also seems to play a very important role in biology. In fact, one of the most important processes in biology, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is where plants and bacteria use energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy to make the molecules of life, to build biomass. Quantum coherence, or quantum superposition, has been discovered in photosynthesis, and the idea is the photon of light, when it hits the chlorophyll molecule, that packet of energy, of sunlight, has to be transported to the reaction center in the cell within this complex, where it can be turned into useful energy inside the cell. And the way it seems to get there is not just by randomly bumping around and maybe finding its way there. It does what that quantum skier does, but it does it in multiple routes. It follows all possible paths to the reaction center simultaneously. And it's only through that combination of paths that you get the high probability of it arriving at the reaction center. In a way that it would take me another hour or 2 hours or longer to explain in greater depth. So I will have to just leave it for you to accept or not accept that experiments now seem to confirm that in photosynthesis, quantum superposition is a very important stage in making sure that this step in photosynthesis is very, very efficient. It's interesting because we're trying to develop our solar cell technology. We're trying to convert sunlight into energy, into electricity that we can use. Are there some lessons that life, that nature has evolved that we can learn from? Again, we don't know. The final example is the craziest example, but it's also the coolest. And that's why the bird makes the headlines, and that's why there's this picture of the wing on the cover of the book. We know many animals around the world that migrate during every year or at regular intervals. Animals migrate making use of lots of different tricks. One of those tricks is a sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic field. So they essentially have a chemical compass inside them that detects the Earth's magnetic field, which helps direct them and guide them from one place to another. Even insects seem to have, some insects seem to have this ability. This is called magnetoreception. The most famous animal to have this ability is the European robin. The European robin spends its spring and summer in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Russia, and in the autumn it flies down to the Mediterranean, down to Spain, sometimes even to the coast of North Africa. So it's a journey of a few thousand miles. And it does this by being sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. This has been known since the 1970s. So a pair of German ornithologists, the Wiltschkows, have made many studies over the years. They capture these birds in mid-migration, in nets. And then they place them inside these cages where they have magnetic fields arranged, what's called a Helmholtz coil. These magnetic fields can simulate the Earth's magnetic field, and they can move them around, and they can control the behavior of these birds where they want to fly, because the birds just want to go down to Spain. They're looking for the sunshine, and they're genetically programmed to follow the Earth's magnetic field. And so they can control and check for sure that they really are sensitive to the magnetic field. The mystery was how. How does the compass work inside the bird's brain? And the only theory we have, I'm not saying this is the correct theory, but the only theory that seems to work relies on quantum mechanics. And it relies on the strangest aspects of quantum mechanics. An aspect so strange that even Einstein found it very puzzling and annoying. He called it spooky action at a distance. We now call it quantum entanglement. This is the idea where you have two separated quantum particles that can still somehow remain in communication with each other instantaneously, such that if you do something to one, if you measure one, it instantly changes the behavior and properties of the other one. Einstein hated it because Einstein's lesson was that, I think this keeps falling down, that's why I run out. I'll just hold it up like this. Einstein's lesson of relativity, look at that, there's such a big change when I hold it. Oh, someone's talking. Oh. Now you can hear me. Okay, the reason Einstein hated quantum entanglement was he said, look, my lesson of relativity is that nothing travels faster than the speed of light. And so you cannot have communication from one particle to another instantly, faster than the speed of light. There must be something wrong with quantum mechanics, something incomplete. Unfortunately for Einstein, he was wrong. Quantum mechanics does behave in this way. And we still don't understand, and we're still arguing about what quantum entanglement really is and how it works. So imagine the surprise when physicists and chemists came up with the idea that quantum entanglement explains how the European robin finds its way. We know that the directional information in the Earth's magnetic field, the compass in the bird, is triggered by light coming into its eye. So it's believed that this compass mechanism that tells it which direction is north and south is somewhere inside the retina. And they've discovered a molecule called cryptochrome, which is photosensitive, so it reacts to light. And in this molecule, you have two electrons, which can be far apart, that are quantum entangled. And these two electrons, they dance together, and they spin, and their behavior is related, such that if you change one, you change the other. And these quantum entangled electrons, their behavior is very, very sensitive to a weak external magnetic field. Because that's the crazy thing about magnetoreception. The Earth's magnetic field is very, very weak. How can it affect chemistry inside living organisms? You understand going into an MRI scanner with a very strong magnetic field to map the body, fine, but the Earth's magnetic field is so weak. Quantum entangled electrons can be sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. So the direction that the bird is flying will change the way these electrons dance together, and will change the signal sent to the bird's brain telling it which way to go. We don't know yet whether this is the correct explanation, but I really hope it is the correct explanation, because it will be so incredible. So where are we now? I want to end my talk, give you a chance to ask me maybe a few questions. We have probably about 5 or 6 different mechanisms or phenomena in biology that seem to require quantum mechanics for them to be explained. But the field is new, and it's still tentative. It's still, there are many scientists who are critical of it. So many physicists will say, come on, you know, quantum mechanics is really hard to detect some of these properties, even in our very careful physics laboratory. It's impossible that it can be happening inside the messy, noisy environment. Biology is messy. Biology is complicated. It's too difficult. Physicists like nice, simple experiments where they can control everything, the temperature and the pressure, and they can control with lasers, and they can do everything nicely and carefully, and nice, simple equations. Biology is complicated. The biologists say, quantum mechanics is complicated. Quantum mechanics is crazy. There's no quantum mechanics going on inside my cells. That's just ridiculous. Leave me alone. And the chemists who are in the middle between the physicists and biologists, they say, what's so surprising? Of course, biology is chemistry, and chemistry depends on quantum rules, so I'm not going to be very excited by it. So they can't see what is so amazing about this. But I predict that this is a subject that just in the last 5 years has grown tremendously. And it may be that it can explain a lot more than we think. It may be that Schrödinger was right, that we can only understand life because of something strange about the quantum world. The quantum world gives a different set of rules. If life has used quantum mechanics to give it an advantage, if it's possible for life to have discovered an advantage from quantum mechanics, it will use it. Life randomly will use all possible tricks, and those tricks that work, that are efficient, they are the ones that will be successful and they'll be used. So it's not really surprising to me that if quantum mechanics is possible inside living cells, then life will have made use of it over the course of almost 4 billion years since life first began on this planet. And so, given that the subject was getting very exciting, John Joe McFadden and I, there's John Joe, decided we should write the first popular science book on quantum biology before somebody else does. So this, you know, it's a cool subject. It's getting very exciting. So a few years ago, we wrote the first book called Life on the Edge, and that's the book that has just come out in Greek, which I'm very excited about. It may be that a lot of it turns out not to be so exciting, but it may also be that quantum biology is a huge area of research in the future, and we don't know where it might lead us. There are people out there who are doing crazy stuff that we acknowledge is crazy. For example, quantum mechanics describes consciousness, and the usual criticism there is quantum mechanics is mysterious and we don't understand it. Consciousness is mysterious and we don't understand it. This does not mean the two are connected. Okay, that is not necessary. But also quantum mechanics is one of those subjects that attracts the really crazy people. Quantum mechanics explains homeopathy. Quantum mechanics explains telepathy. Quantum mechanics explains all the magic, you know, because quantum mechanics is strange and it gives them the license, it gives them the reason to use it as an excuse to explain their crazy theories. So quantum biology has to move slowly and carefully and only rely on experimental results and theoretical calculations and modeling. But hopefully in a few years' time it'll be a much more established area of science. I'll have to remember to come back and give you another talk and give you an update when that happens. Thank you very much.